What do we do when God does not make sense? When something happens in our life and we struggle to understand why God would allow it? Over the past few weeks, we've been exploring that question together. We looked at why sometimes God says no, because he sees us, sees what we cannot, and knows what is truly best for us. We reflected on suffering and how painful experiences can become holy ground. And last week, we examined how obstacles and difficulties lead us to depend more on him. Today, we turn to another situation that can leave us frustrated and discouraged. Why does God allow wrong people to be in charge? Why does God allow leaders who misuse their authority to remain in positions of power? We see this over and over again in the Bible, and we see it constantly on the world stage, where political leaders make decisions that affect millions. But we also can see it closer to home, in families, in communities, even in the church, and in workplaces. Years ago, when I was working in the financial services industry, there was a senior leader I worked under who always came across as very gracious in public settings, polite, appreciative, encouraging towards people. But in smaller leadership meetings, his tone could be very different. He would criticize harshly his team. Their abilities would be questioned, and decisions about people often seemed to ignore the human aspect. I remember wondering how someone with that much authority could lead that way. Leadership has enormous influence. When leadership is healthy, it helps communities and organizations flourish. When leadership becomes unjust, when authority is exercised poorly, it can wound deeply. In today's gospel, we encounter religious leaders whose authority had lost its way. In John's account, Jesus encounters a man who had been born blind from birth. Jesus heals him. For the man, it's a life-changing experience. But not everybody sees it that way. The man's brought before the Pharisees, the religious leaders, the very people who are supposed to help others recognize the work of God. And what do they think of this remarkable event? Well, they were jealous of Jesus, and so they had no intention of accepting him as a miracle worker. That would only expand his growing popularity. So instead of rejoicing in what happened, they set out to discredit and dismiss the healing. They challenge the man. They confront his parents. In their interpretation of the law, healing on the Sabbath meant Jesus had committed a sin. Therefore, he could not be from God. So instead of celebrating the miracle, the Pharisees worked to protect their authority. Instead of encouraging truth, they create fear. The man's parents are afraid to speak openly because they know the leaders can expel them from the synagogue. And they pressure the man to deny that the miracle was from God. In the end, the man who had been blind resists the pressure. He says, "I was blind and now I see." And it is unheard of that anyone ever opened the eyes of a person born blind if they were not from God. He simply tells the truth. And for that, the Pharisees throw him out. This is what injustice can look like, even when it wears religious clothing. Authority disconnected from Christ eventually protects itself more than it serves the people. The man who had been blind could now see, but the leaders who claimed to see were blind to God's truth. The danger, though, is not just in leaders who can be blind to truth and goodness. There's also a danger of what can happen inside us when we experience leadership like this. How do we respond to unjust leadership? Do we constantly complain? Do we criticize them harshly? Do we assume the worst of their motivations? Do we spread gossip, especially online? I know in my life, at one time or another, I've been guilty of most of those. And if we aren't careful, our hearts can begin to fill with resentment, ill will, and anger. Our hearts can become stones. Now let's be clear, injustice is real. Poor leadership can cause harm. It wounds people, creates fear, damages trust. So when something is unjust, we have a right, a duty to work toward creating it or correcting it. But injustice does not give us the permission to sin. We are still responsible for how we respond. In the first reading today, the Lord reminds Samuel of something important. Man looks at appearances, but the Lord looks at the heart. Not just the heart of the leader we're struggling with, but our heart as well. So the real question becomes, how do we respond? As disciples, we're called to respond differently, to respond with the heart of Jesus, beginning with prayer. Bring the situation to God, the frustration, the confusion, the hurt. Ask God to help us to grow in patience, humility, and charity. Because Christian love means willing the good of the other, even that person we're having difficulty with. We are called to be witnesses of Christ. God loved that person into existence, and Christ died for them just as he did for us, even though that's sometimes hard to rationalize, but it's true. A powerful prayer is to desire that even that unjust leader might one day be in heaven with you. If there's someone who's been difficult for you, someone whose leadership has caused you frustration or hurt, I ask you to bring them to mind now and quietly place them before the Lord in prayer. Lord, I place this person in your hands. Help me to desire their good, and one day may we both be in heaven with you. So today we began with the question, why does God allow the wrong people to be in the position of authority? But injustice is not something God created. It's one more sign that we live in a fallen world wounded by sin. And the deeper question we found is how to respond with the heart of Christ. Not with bitterness, but with virtue. Not with gossip, but with prayer. Not with contempt, but with consecration. The world doesn't need more critics. It needs disciples who can see injustice clearly and still love with the heart of Christ. Injustice may wound us, but it doesn't get to decide who we become. And I wanted to have a note that after Mass today, again, as we've been doing Sundays in Lent, we will have prayer teams in the back of the Holy Spirit wing. We'll be praying for anyone who wants to have prayer over them. So if there's something on your heart or something that doesn't make sense, after Mass you can come and be prayed over.